All right. It's great to be here. You might think, actually, given my title, that I was going to follow trying to build a world out of Lego, which would be easier than you're trying to build a toaster. But I want to talk about how to think about all the things that we've been hearing about and that we see in a very different concept of the world, and then I hope a very different concept of foreign policy. So the title we have is World Rebalancing. So here I thought, well, you know, I'm a professor, and I'm just going to put this up here and maybe call on you and ask you to figure out what I mean. Actually, this is the world rebalancing. I can't tell you how long it took me to do this on PowerPoint, and I was so proud of myself until I showed up here this morning and looked at, you know, this kind of thing and some of the other graphics. But, you know, for me, this was a big deal. So this was the 1980s, right? This is what the world looked like in the 1980s, bilateral, bipolar configuration of power, the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the 1990s. It was never actually like this, but this was what many people thought, the United States as hyperpower. And this is today, right? A bunch of different countries, Indonesia, Turkey, China, India, the EU, the US, South Africa, et cetera. That is how most people in my field think about the world. And really, if we were just doing this traditionally, I could sit down now, turn it over to Wayne and Puck. They could talk about how the fact that we have more competition means we have to renew ourselves, and that would be the end of the lecture. But I'd like to take you a little further. But that's the first rebalancing. I actually listened to what you told me the topic was here. This is the second rebalancing. The first one was horizontal, right? From one state, two states, one state, multiple states. This is vertical. This is from a world of states to a world in which non-state actors, let's call them social actors. Clay Shirky says non-state actors is like calling a car a horseless carriage. So let's call these social actors. But power devolving from states to social actors. And my examples here are the UN General Assembly, which meets every September. On one side of Manhattan, it is the old world par excellence. It is all states coming together. As one, the head of the European Union says, it's speed dating for diplomats. That's one side of New York. On the other side is the Clinton Global Initiative, which is one representation of how lots of different actors come together to solve global problems. If you look here, you have a CEO, you have a head of an NGO, you have a government official, you have a university professor. Those are basically the coalitions he puts together. So that is a vertical rebalancing from state power to power of social actors. It's been going on for a while. Back in the 1990s, we had the Landmines Treaty, the International Criminal Court. Those were brought about by NGOs and then ultimately concluded by states. But this is not new. All right. I want to get at what those power shifts mean for states and for the international system. So this is the first, the traditional way of seeing the world. A world of states as billiard balls. For those of you who ever took a course in international relations, this is a very familiar way of thinking about the international system. The international system, of course, really exists in our heads in terms of there's no thing out there. There's interactions of different actors, and we can represent it any way we want. Traditionally, we thought about it as billiard balls. As we have moved from a world of states to a world of governments and social actors, we've come to a networked world, and in that networked world, those entities that we used to think of as billiard balls are nodes in much larger sets of networks. Think about a subway network. Think about states now as platforms and containers for all these different networks that create the society around them. So we move from a billiard ball to a networked world. In that world, foreign policy has started to shift. First, you have orchestrated coalitions. So thinking about, it's not just governments anymore. We face all sorts of problems from terrorism to the prosperity of the state of the global economy to climate change to global health. We are now trying to tackle those problems by top-down coalitions. And I have here the example of clean cook stoves. So Here I'm going to use a very old-fashioned prop. It's actually this remarkable little piece of technology. It's called paper. The Alliance for Global Cook Stoves puts together lots of different government ministries, corporations, non-governmental organizations, to do something that seems very basic, but that has a huge global effect. Bad, inefficient wooden cook stoves adds to carbon, terrible for health of women and families eating in small huts with carbon cook stoves, with wood-fired cook stoves, and is very bad for women's safety. They have to go out and collect wood. So if you could actually improve those cook stoves, you would actually get a trifecta. You would improve you would much reduce the amount of carbon emissions, you'd improve health, and you would improve women's safety. So what's interesting about this coalition is it's parts of governments. It's the Environmental Protection Agency, the Health and Human Services Agency, the USAID, the Department of our Development Agency, the State Department, fitting together with the German Economic Ministry, the German Development Ministry, parts of the Peruvian government, parts of the Norwegian government, parts of the Dutch government, but then coming together with Shell, with the Shell Foundation, with Morgan Stanley, and ultimately with the UN Foundation. So this massive coalition with the aim of getting 100 million clean cook stoves by 2020, which would be tremendous. Second one is gas flares. Same idea. Gas flares have health effects. They lose gas just in terms of business loss. They're bad for agriculture, and they're all over the world. Top-down coalition, actually, where the World Bank has gotten together 14 of the world's oil-producing companies and 10 major oil producers to come together to develop new technology, to capture more of this gas, to be able to market it, to reduce its environmental effects. These are top-down. Equally interesting, indeed, I think more interesting, more important for where we're going, is bottom-up. This is build local, go global, and many of you are part of these initiatives, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. This is the move from the U.S. Agency for International Development to Kiva, where Kiva allows all of us to find our projects, to donate as we want, and ultimately can create coalitions and communities that support communities in other countries. Growing very much bottom up. Same thing, NDI, National Democratic Institute. That's the standard way we did election monitoring. Governments send in teams of election monitors. But Ushahidi in Kenya means witness in Swahili. Many of you are bound to know this technology again. It's a platform that allows people all over it participating in elections to report what they see, to report violence, to report fraud, and then to map that and conclude the results. That's bottom up. It's being used in many other places like Haiti, now in Syria, but again, it's bottom up. Same thing, maybe a little less well known, the Special Envoy for Gaza Disengagement. That was the former World Bank President Jim Wolfenson. The Quartet, which is the US and the European Union and Russia and the UN, in charge of the efforts to start negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. They hired former World Bank president to be the Special Envoy for Gaza Disengagement, and he was supposed to be in charge of reconstruction of Gaza. Hadn't worked so well. Now we have the Palestinian Political Risk Insurance Project. This recognizes that if you are going to try to invest in the West Bank or Gaza, if you're a local entrepreneur and you want to make things and export them, you face tremendous political risk from political instability. So you are much less likely to actually invest. The Center for American Progress, joining with a Palestinian insurance company, with another NGO, created the Palestinian Risk Insurance Project, where they're actually providing risk insurance for small entrepreneurs. That's bottom up. The U.S. Agency for International Development is actually providing some funding, but that's not where the idea came from. And I could offer you thousands and thousands of other examples. So what's the result? Think about these top-down coalitions, and if you note in the top-down coalitions, it's not the state, it's different parts of the state. And you could do the same thing with state governments here or municipal governments. And then bottom up, all these social actors who come up with ideas and projects that then often mix and match with different states. Well, the result is Lego states. Think about those billiard balls. Think about that old-fashioned vision of the state as this opaque thing. We never looked inside it. We never cared. Actors inside it were limited to interacting with their government. And now imagine being able to take it completely apart. Federal government, state government, local government, Camden government. And then recombine those pieces in countless different ways with social actors. That is what we're heading for. And it has profound implications for how we think about foreign policy. When I say how we think about foreign policy, what I mean is how we go about solving national and global problems. So Lego states, it's amazing what you can find. I Googled Lego billiard ball, and that's what came up. You gotta love it. Here's the visual, right? The traditional world is this world of billiard balls of states that go to war, that threaten each other, that occasionally negotiate treaties to cooperate, create international institutions. And on the right, that is Lego world. That is where, again, you can disassemble states and recreate them in countless communities, networks, projects, initiatives. All right. Oh, sorry. The one thing I wanted to point out here, those networks, those also contribute to resilience. I'm framing them in terms of affirmative efforts to solve problems, but obviously the relationships they create, all the ways in which they give you networks and abilities for different communities to form. When bad things happen, those are the sinews of resilience. All right, but thus far I've just been describing what we see, and I've been trying to give you a different intellectual framework, or I prefer the term mental map, for how to think about it, because those maps are incredibly important. If you think about states as billiard balls, you're not going to come up with anything other than very basic guns and bombs issues. If you think more broadly about how you could disassemble states and recreate parts of them and connect them to social actors, you've got all sorts of opportunities. But how do we actually encourage, improve, enable these kinds of projects? One response would just be, well, don't. Just let it happen, and government should mostly get out of the way. Maybe occasionally provide a platform, and certainly everybody likes funding. But you've probably noticed government has less and less funding. And in fact, government is looking more and more to social actors to do lots of things that government used to do. In foreign assistance, that's particularly obvious, but so in terms of climate, so in terms of health. I just went to the Washington Ideas Forum, and every single government official who spoke mentioned public-private partnerships. So government doesn't have a lot of money. They could, as I said, just be passive. But surely there are ways in which we can make it easier for these communities to form, networks to form. We can improve them. We can find ways to connect them so that they have a greater impact. Just as in the 1980s, 1990s, traditionally government has done foreign policy, now we should be able to enable things. But how? So here are some initial thoughts, and here I'm hoping to learn from all of you. What I'm trying to do is to learn from what we know about network theory, about complexity theory, about horizontal management, about many of the things we're talking about in these 3 days, to see if there's some lessons that could be gleaned for a government. Again, that could be the federal government and the State Department, or it could be any government, to actually enable what I see as a new era of citizen social actor foreign policy. So the first thing I would tell my former government colleagues is don't just do something, stand there. That's all we do in government. We want deliverables. That's any trip, any plan. What are we going to do? What project are we going to launch? What initiative are we going to announce? Well, actually, in many cases, if you are thinking about a country, you want to think about strengthening fragile institutions, don't do anything. Figure out what's already there. Map it. Look at who's there. Look at how they're working. Look at how they could be connected better. Second, there are ways you can connect people. In fact, embassies are very well placed to do that often, where they have broad contacts, they have a certain amount of legitimacy, depends on what country you're in. But even in countries where people are often anti-American, there are roles that embassies can play. But we don't want to connect too much. Indeed, we've heard from Arab revolutions, one of the great strengths of the way they evolved was lots and lots and lots of little groups connected so that if one got knocked out, not everything fell down. One of the things we know from network theory is do not connect all the time. There can be too much connection. So thinking about the different forms of networks and what kinds of connections you want to make. Is it going to be more like an information network, like a telephone tree, or is it going to be more like a bucket brigade? And where do you actually want to stop those connections? Third, I think I'm preaching to the choir in this crowd, small is beautiful. Right? Clay Shirky is doing some very interesting work, and I'm sure there's much more of it out there, on if you want to get the energy of collaboration, you want relatively small communities. You don't want to connect everybody together. You won't get the kind of participation and buy-in that you will in smaller communities. So thinking about what the optimum scale is when you're bringing together and convening. All right. Fourth, portals and plugins everywhere. Again, this is a conference about connection, but from government, we think about silos, right? It is not easy to plug into government. You know that, right? That's what the open government movement is about. By providing information, you provide lots and lots of ways for people to actually connect, to plug into a project, to use the data in a valuable way. So thinking about how actually to maximize government's ability to do positive things where social actors are involved is to create portals and plugins wherever you can. And finally, and here's certainly, as far as I can tell, where we know the least but has the greatest potential, ultimately, you don't want government or anybody organizing other people. The power of what we see in emergent systems, the power of what we see in the Middle East, the power of what we see beginning here, and when you have, I would say, occupying Wall Street, or indeed any kind of meetup and groups, it's self-organization. So ultimately, we need to think about how government can facilitate and enable and create conditions, but government shouldn't do. It's got to ultimately about facilitating self-organization, whether that's within this country or around the world. Okay, I've got 1 extra minute here. So I'm at the outset of thinking about this, and this is not a year project, this is a decade project, and we are going to look back in 20, 30 years, and the whole idea of what foreign policy is and how we tackle problems that are collective to all of us is going to change profoundly. But one thing I'm certain of, if we want to do this, we're going to have to change the way we think about our professions. We've got to think about different roles. So here are some current professions: editor, publisher, reporter, public relations manager, diplomat. That one's pretty standard. All right, here's some of the ways they have to change. I don't know if we're going to use these titles, but these roles have to be filled, and people like me have to start educating people for these roles. Finder, mapper, right? Instead of a reporter and an editor, somebody who's out there finding the facts, but also mapping all the different actors who are in a space. Verifier, curator. Andrew is a curator. I started out by saying I bill myself as a foreign policy curator on Twitter because I'm using my expertise to figure out what's important and what's not, and I hope making people's lives richer by sending that out. But most people think curators are still for museums or art galleries. We have to be able to think about training people as curators and verifiers. Same thing, actually this should have been reversed. The reporter is more the finder and the mapper. The publisher is more of an aggregator. Public relations is about image. This isn't about image. The public face of any entity actually has to be the convener, has to be the person that brings together lots and lots of different actors, looking out at the space, relying on the ability to map and to aggregate and to verify, and then to convene. Diplomats are connectors, or they're going to have to be. I do not see anytime soon the Foreign Service advertising for connectors. I understand that that's probably going to take a while. But that's really how we need to think about diplomats, not as people who sit in embassies and represent the United States in formal negotiations, and that's unfair to many diplomats. That's not what they're even doing now. But we need to think about them as mapping as much social space as they can, not just interacting with governments, and then connecting. And finally, the idea of leadership changes profoundly. It's certainly not about getting out front and expecting people to follow, but it's not even necessarily about setting direction, except perhaps in the very broadest way, and even then, it's enabling people to figure out what direction they want to go. Ultimately, leaders in this kind of image of a global, networked Lego world is a catalyst. All right. I hope I've given you a new way of thinking about what's possible in the global sphere, about the idea that foreign policy is as much for any group, individual, corporation, foundation, thinker who cares about global problems as it is for governments, about ways in which government can be disaggregated and then re-aggregated with lots and lots of different social actors, but then about how we actually can facilitate those kinds of networks so that they're effective, so that ultimately they are solving problems, whether those are problems of water, cook stoves, health, disarmament, democracy, rule of law, you fill in the blanks. And for that, we need new thinking, and I'm very happy to introduce, well, I'm going to let you introduce my former colleagues, Wayne Porter and Puck Michelby, to talk about a new strategy. Thank you very much.